Good evening. My name is Peter Agner. I am the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. If this is your first time with us, I invite you to learn more about our institution at gothamcenter.org, our website, where you can find hundreds of podcasts, recorded interviews, panel discussions, essays, book reviews, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. And those of you looking for a more intensive learning experience may also be interested in our new online education program, which offers mini courses with leading experts and scholars on a wide range of topics at convenient times and friendly prices. You can see the current menu at gothamed.com. That said, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Susan Nagel. We'll be talking about this invigorating new book just published last month on the decision to move the US Capitol from New York City to Washington, DC. At the Gotham Center, we regularly make the claim that historically speaking, no city is more important to the development of the United States than New York. It has been, for most of our history, in most respects, the unofficial capital of the nation, the headquarters for business and finance, culture and society, the arts and sciences, political reform, and much else. But unlike most countries, America is distinguished by having a capital that is purely designed for government. The majority of what is conveniently described, or conventionally described rather, as the life of the nation happens elsewhere. The reason for this quirk has come down to us over time because of Thomas Jefferson, who described a city at war in the years in which all the major elite founding figures walked the streets of lower Manhattan, when it served as the capital during the period of independence after the American Revolution and in the early days of the new constitutional republic. Jefferson's account has been seared into national consciousness as the Great Compromise of 1790, the so-called dinner table bargain, familiarized to a whole new generation by Lin-Manuel Miranda's breakout musical in the song, The Room Where It Happens. But according to Nagel, the major players in this drama were just two men, George Washington and Philip Schuyler, a far less well-known figure who served as the senator representing New York. Their parallel dreams, she argues, sparked an intense, decades-long rivalry for the location of America's new capital. Hamilton, son-in-law to Schuyler and surrogate son to Washington, was helplessly caught in the middle, she writes. Jefferson stood by, openly seething on the sidelines, and the location was not, she argues, settled at that famous dinner. I will leave it to her to explain that, but suffice it to say, the conflict revolved in great part around the establishment of America's first major transportation system, canals, public infrastructure that would, in the early republic, as in every later period, provide the basis for most of the private sector's development. Schuyler argued that New York was the natural place for a capital because its harbor could transport goods and people from the ocean, up the Hudson, and over the Great Lakes, down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Washington argued that the Potomac provided similar access to the interior of North America, and he was intent on depriving the northern city of its capital status. Both men were landlords and commercial innovators who would be immeasurably enriched by the decision too. So from this vantage, the true story of that legendary dinner party, Nagel argues, is one of unchecked greed. So without giving away any more, allow me to introduce our speaker. Susan Nagel is the author of two biographies, Marie-Therese, Child of Terror, about the only child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to survive the French Revolution, and Mistress of the Elgin Marbles on Mary Nisbet, the social, political, and diplomatic innovator and daughter of the wealthiest family in late 18th century Scotland. She also published a critically acclaimed book on the novels of Jean Giraudoux, considered one of the most important French dramatists of the interwar period. Before she began her life as an independent historian, wrote a number of plays produced off Broadways in the 1980s and 90s. She has written for the screen as well, and the media, working for the Gannett newspaper chain, as well as Town and Country. For many years, she was also a professor in the humanities department at Marymount Manhattan College, and she has published in a number of scholarly journals. I'm delighted to welcome her here. It's my extreme pleasure as well to introduce our discussant this evening, Alexis Coe. Alexis is also an independent historian, the author of the New York Times bestseller, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington, as well as Alice and Frida Forever, A Murder in Memphis. She's now working on a third book, I just learned, about the young John F. Kennedy. And with a grant from Substack, She recently launched a newsletter titled deliciously, Study, Marry, Kill. That's 2 R's. She was a consulting producer on Doris Kearns Goodwin's series on Washington for the History Channel, in which she also appeared, and she can often be seen discussing presidential history on MSNBC, CNN, and other stations. She's been a host on the series No Man's Land and co-host of Presidents Are People Too, and has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New Republic, Paris Review, Glamour, and many other journals and magazines. Several of those pieces included in titles collecting the best essays of those years. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome her here as well. I'm going to turn it over to Alexis now to begin our conversation with just a tiny bit of housekeeping first. As always, discussion will last until about 7:30 or so, at which point we'll take your questions. We're going to disable the chat function in Zoom out of respect to our speakers, but I encourage you to send in questions at any time during the conversation using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So with that, please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers with a bit of silent applause.
Hello, welcome. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Alexis.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
On Patriotism and Profit, which was, I really enjoyed it. And before we launch into this conversation, I'm going to ask you to give us something that I don't like doing. I hate when I'm asked to do this, but an elevator pitch to sort of summarize the book.
Well, it's about 2 entrepreneurs and a younger man who is surrogate son to Washington and son-in-law to Philip Schuyler, and the parallel dreams of these 2 men to take their entrepreneurial skills and move them west, open the canal systems, and place a capital city of empire. And you know, why is that important? Because the capital city of any empire establishes the empire on its feet, its morals, its values. It's what we know about of all the ancient empires. So it was a struggle for basically the soul of this country.
You pair Washington and Schuyler in a way that really hasn't been done before. And, you know, obviously I've spent a lot of time with Washington, and I've thought about his childhood a lot. And I always made the connection to Benedict Arnold, because they both felt like they had been wronged and they couldn't control their temper and such, but then they depart. What's interesting here is there's not this departure. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but they really do have a very similar life story.
Very, very similar. The biggest difference is that Philip Schuyler was actually an aristocrat, and George Washington was not born of the first families of Virginia. So he had to fight his way up, and how he did that was to acquire land. Philip Schuyler was, born and raised with an inheritance that was typical of the land barons of New York State, the 4 or 5 Dutch clans that inherited massive amount of land. That was pretty much the biggest difference between the 2 men. Both of their fathers died when they were young. Both of them were unique in sailing west and getting to know the indigenous peoples. Both of them were entrepreneurs. They milled, they stilled, they butchered, they were experimented on breeding animals. They both liked to read. They both were fiercely proud of this country, and they both wanted canal systems. They saw that as the future to open up the continent.
You talk about land, and land was obviously so important in early America. But when we talk about land, we're not saying that it was acquired by purchase. There were all sorts of ways in which these men got land, and in Washington in particular, it came from some of his early pursuits with the Virginia militia, starting, a little world war. How did they get all this land, and when did it start?
Well, New York State, of course, was populated by the Dutch. And then there was a war in the 1660s, and the British actually never took the land away from the Dutch. They were, as long as they weren't disturbed, they didn't bother the Dutch. So these people like Philip Schuyler, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the Van Cortlands, those families married each other, kept marrying each other, and that the estates were so intertwined and people really inherited their properties. They also had a lot of land in lower Manhattan because New York City was always valuable property. George Washington's family was not in what they call the Tidewater area, which was where the aristocratic families were, Williamsburg, the James River, the York River. So his family bought property as you went up the Potomac in places like Fredericksburg, or where we know Mount Vernon to be, in tiny little creeks off the Potomac. They had smaller farms, and he was not of the aristocracy. So he went to war on behalf of the British in the 7 Years' War, and he was promised land. And so many times in his life, the king just reneged. Oh, it's going to be too expensive to keep waging war with the native tribes. I think I'm not going to give you the land I promised. Time after time after time, this happened to George Washington. So finally, of course, he said, I've had it. I've been, carving out these roads, and I've been traveling west, and I've been fighting for King George, and they're not giving me what I'm owed. So he, of course, petitioned the royal governor and said, I'm going to pretty much tell all the soldiers to go on strike if you don't sign something and give us the land. So he did get a lot of land that way. He also was the son of a second wife, so he wasn't really promised any land because these were British citizens, and they followed the primogeniture law. And that is the eldest son, the firstborn son, inherits everything. Well, luckily or unluckily for George Washington, his eldest brother died, the wife died, the child died. So George Washington ended up with a bit of land at a very young age and became a landlord like Philip Schuyler. So they not only owned some land, they rented parcels out, they decided they would develop mills and towns, and much like, the feudal Europe.
And this is important. What you're describing, we think of as, American business, but they were always like this. And in particular, Washington, because he was the second family, he felt like he really needed to make up for that. He wanted to get ahead. It was really important to him to sort of gain that back. But there's this sort of misunderstanding that the founders were, out protesting in the streets. And when we talk about Washington in particular, and we talk about the Virginians, they didn't approve of that. They wrote letters, they didn't approve of the destruction of property at the Boston Tea Party. And I think that it's really interesting to think about Washington as, at the time of his death, one of the wealthiest men in America. He started out there.
Self-made. He really was.
Totally. But he's land rich and cash poor.
Absolutely.
We say that about Virginians, but I'd love you to tell us about why this is really an exceptional case.
Well, I just want to tell you something kind of entertaining to drive the point home. Because people think of George Washington as this vastly rich man and president of the United States and, general and world famous, and who wouldn't want to marry George Washington? Well, he was turned down a few times by girls who did not see him as a great prospect. One of the girls who turned him down was a young woman who eventually married a British soldier. And they owned a house on the Upper West Side of New York, known today as the Morris Jumel Mansion. So in kind of poetic justice, when George Washington became president, he would give parties at her abandoned mansion on the Upper West Side, the Morris Jumel Mansion, as the most important man in the country. And I thought, those walls, if those walls could talk, and the fact that she, turned down his offer of marriage, I thought he probably thought living well was the best revenge. So
it's true. I mean, he really did propose to just about any rich girl who came in his path for a while. And then his retirement plan, when he was completely fed up with the Virginia militia, was Martha. Peter already brought this up, the room where it happens.
Yes.
One of the, one of the best songs from the soundtrack. They're all quite good, but one of the best songs. And it's based on Ron Chernow's book. And this is his emphasis on Jefferson, on, sort of pulling back with Washington. It's a very different narrative than you are giving us, which is not to say that that doesn't happen. We're always learning more. Last year, someone who works at the Schuyler Mansion discovered that Hamilton had actually owned slaves. How did you come to realize this, and how nervous were you sort of about taking on this entire establishment and also creative spinoff?
Well, you and I are going to have a conversation about the thigh men that you write about in your book, the men who see Washington on a horse, a marble statue, and absolutely flawless. I started this project looking at the 1780s, when New York City was the capital of our country. It was a boom town. It, of course, had been under British control during the Revolutionary War. And there were these great, young, attractive people, all members of the Dutch clans. And it reminded me of the go-go 1980s. They were starting abolitionist movements. They were starting charitable organizations. They were opening theaters. The life was so vibrant. And I wondered, just like Mrs. Adams, why on earth would you want to leave New York? It won't be Broadway. So I thought, why did they leave New York City? It made no sense. And I started looking backwards into letters and actually figured out and read, primary sources are the only way to go. And George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all of their colleagues from Virginia for years had been worried about New York City and upper New York State developing what we now know as the Erie Canal. Washington even invested along the Mohawk River. He was no fool. He was a very good land investor. And they were very worried about New York getting there first. The letters are filled with, we've got to beat the Yorkers. And they would do measurements out to the Ohio River, which is faster, which is shorter. How can we get from Alexandria, Virginia to, what is today Cincinnati, Ohio? And this was an obsession for all of them. So that is what really interested me. And then I began to see how Philip Schuyler and George Washington were obsessed with canals. So I realized there was a parallel story, and there was a really intense rivalry between the two of them, and they were best friends. And there was a very dramatic scene after the Continental Congress decides that we are going to war, and George Washington is going to be our commander-in-chief. Philip Schuyler is a major general, and the two of them depart Philadelphia side by side on horses. And to me, that's this powerful moment. And they really had a lifelong friendship, even though after the Congress left New York City, Peter Schuyler was very disappointed because he knew the machinations that had gone on behind it. And he had invested a lot of money in helping the Congress stay in New York City, refurbishing the federal buildings and things like that, and providing a beautiful home for the President of the United States. So there was disappointment, but they remained lifelong friends. And George Washington was a godfather to one of Philip Schuyler's children.
When we think about needy founding fathers, insecure founding fathers, you think John Adams, and he sort of dominates. But Jefferson was sort of destabilized by this. He felt excluded, and has played a role in sort of inflating his role in this. So can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. He was in Paris and came back in the spring of 1790 and had very little to do with what was going on behind the scenes with the federal funding vote and where are we going to, try to move the capital city at that time. And he later, in 1792, when he and Alexander Hamilton were really at loggerheads, he really despised Hamilton, and he did everything he could in very underhanded ways, as we know, trying to get him accused of being an adulterer and things like that. He practiced his story on George Washington. he tried it out and said, I don't know why, I'm paraphrasing, kind of like, I don't know why you really love this Alexander Hamilton. I've been such a better son to you. As a matter of fact, I have this dinner party and I got the capital city moved for you. And so he tried that story out on him and talked about this dinner party, and he wrote about it later. Nobody in 1790 ever said there was a dinner party and Thomas Jefferson solved the problem, and we voted on it the day after. Nobody else believed that. It went on for weeks after this alleged dinner party. So this was a story he created. He also sanitized Washington's role in it, because why would we want to provide the world with a founding hero that was less than perfect? So that's where we get this man on a horse, a marble statue of this perfect man. And I really was unhappy with that, because you can still admire people who are flawed. And I don't even know if you think that being an entrepreneur is a flawed, aspect of someone's character.
With the founders, people love them to be pure and simple and sort of one-dimensional in some ways, but of course they were people.
They were people.
And ambitious people. Yep. And the stakes were pretty high, and they were dealing with a lot of power. I remember a story of the Conway Cabal, and Washington even wrote this to Benjamin Rush about how he took off his glasses in a moment of theatricality and wiped a tear from his eyes, and so people felt sympathetic, for him. He was very much not the perfect, flawless man. He knew when to play his hand. He knew how to behave. He knew when to make other people do his dirty work, which he did. Yes, Jefferson said he's going to leave us holding the bag when Washington retired.
Well, he did that with family members. He told them to go and buy him real estate. Don't let anybody know that they were buying it on his behalf. He removed people who had, previous rights to land that he thought was his, and he sued them. I mean, he took them to court and threw them off his land, and he would have people kind of front men to do all this kind of dirty work for him as a landlord. And then he encouraged a few Virginia representatives to vote for Hamilton's funding bill, and said, I'll put the capital where you are, and your constituents will get over the idea that you're voting for the funding. And then, of course, he didn't do what he said he was going to do, and their reputations were ruined.
These are great stories, and that's why we should have diverse presidential history, and particularly with the founders, because complexity has been treated like a liability, and it's not. It tells us more about our country and ourselves. And another way that you did this, which is also one of my tricks, is you certainly look at all the letters, but you follow the money.
Yes.
And
yes.
It gets you have to get in it, and it's very complicated. But talk to me about their finances and their assets. It was spread, and for Washington, it was spread pretty thin. He had to borrow money to go to the inauguration.
He had to borrow money to go to the inauguration. He borrowed money to buy land along the Mohawk River from Governor Clinton of New York. It took him a very long time to pay back part of it. The Virginians really liked to live well. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, died bankrupt with a fabulous collection of wine. And George Washington believed in that aristocratic, hospitality, and he went over the top in spending money, and they were, as you said, cash poor and land rich. Philip Schuyler, on the other hand, he'd inherited so much money, so much land, that he never had a problem. He was never poor. He went off to England, and he went to see the Bridgewater canals because he wanted to see canals work. George Washington only went to Barbados with his brother, and he couldn't afford to travel. So in that sense, they had, a very different lifestyle, even though George Washington was, allowed to constantly spend money he said he would pay back.
They did love their finery.
They really did.
Materials that they would get, and they were never happy with it. none of them were ever happy with the management, with the goods that they got.
Right.
They were demanding.
Well, the truth of it was also they were limited to getting goods that were inferior from Great Britain, until obviously they declared independence. So Great Britain would say the Americans have no taste, just let's send them last year's styles, or, woolens with holes in them or moth holes or something. So of course they would get this stuff shipped to them and complain and say, you can't possibly charge me that. Look at this thing. It's got a really bad weave. Why are you sending me inferior goods? So yes, they did complain.
One of my favorite letters from Washington is when he's complaining about a hoe. And he said, this hoe is from the days of yore. It was, he did not like people messing with his money, but it wasn't really his money.
That's right.
It was Martha's money. And I think what we're getting at, so we've talked about Washington and how he needed to sort of restore his family to this place. But he gets there and then he surpasses anything that his, father, who he didn't really know, right, and his brother, all of those. He was such an entrepreneur, but there's this, in every way, and you touched on this, but like, if he heard that the enslaved people were fishing and doing quite well, he was like, okay, so I guess I should sell fish at the market because obviously this is an opportunity. He was always innovating, but that's not how we think of him.
No.
Why?
I don't know. That's a really good question. And of course he, I don't know how else to put it, but he really was an entrepreneur and a capitalist. And so was Philip Schuyler. Philip Schuyler kind of fooled around with little canals up the St. Lawrence River to Lake Champlain. And even Benjamin Franklin went up to visit it. And some of the people who lived along the Potomac, who were members of the shareholders of the Potomac Canal Company from Maryland, the Carrolls, they went up to visit Schuyler's little canal systems to see how he did it. They were always innovating, both Washington and Schuyler, thinking of a new way, a better way, designing things, sailboats, canoes, you name it. Philip Schuyler would draw boats and try to have them constructed and say, oh, this will go faster. We can use this on a creek that nothing else will work, will sail on. They both were very, very, very complex people and very innovative.
Constantly. They loved to learn. That was something that they all really shared.
Yes. And, Washington was an autodidact. He read everything. He wasn't, like Madison went to Princeton and all of these other guys that he socialized with were very well educated and he never had that opportunity, but he read everything. And if he found out his stepson was learning something at school, he'd grab the books also and try to learn them. He also had joined the New York Society Library, and they have records of the books that he took out, that he borrowed. And again, Philip Schuyler was very well educated. He went to the same boarding school that John Jay did, and they were cousins. And I was going to make the point that the young clans, the really glamorous young clans who were running New York City at the time in the 1780s, were all first cousins. The wives were all first cousins. So this was really a very, very tight-knit group, and their husbands were all important, and they kind of ran society and culture, and it was a very exciting time. And, I do call them the go-go 80s, but they were the go-go 1780s.
Really, people were, Washington and Martha didn't like to socialize too much, but they could not resist a ball. They were always partying.
There are funny, diary entries of some of these young women saying, I danced with President Washington, he stepped all over my feet. So.
I know, but which is really, those were interesting letters because it's at odds with everything else that you hear about him, which is that he's so graceful and, everything he does is with the height of athleticism.
Well, I actually was interested in the real man. And maybe it's just me, I love alpha men. I thought he was an alpha male. And I have no problem with him, being a little clumsy, being a little aggressive, being a capitalist, and being a very strong figure, and not just a statue that cannot tell a lie because he didn't cut down the cherry tree. I find that kind of saccharine.
I worked on a Washington TV series as well with Doris Kearns Goodwin. And so it was interesting to interpret Washington in these different ways. And at one point I realized, I was in the writer's room, early days, that the writers were uncomfortable with this idea of ambition. But
Interesting.
every president has had it, and no one more than the founders.
Yep.
And that is also what led Jefferson to inflate his role.
Well, to me, an interesting story was how did New York City become the capital city? And a lot of people also blamed Alexander Hamilton. There was a mutiny in Philadelphia. And this goes to our conversation we're having today about Washington, D.C. becoming a state. There was a mutiny in Philadelphia on a hot Saturday afternoon. A lot of the soldiers who had not been paid decided they were going to point their bayonets through the windows at Independence Hall at our founding fathers. They almost killed them. So the founding fathers asked the governor of Pennsylvania to help. And he said, I'm not getting involved. Well, they had to escape out, the back doors, the back windows, and they ended up in New Jersey. Each state at that time had its own jurisdiction, its own currency. This was not a unified nation until the Constitution was, ratified. So they ended up in New Jersey. And Alexander Hamilton, from that moment on, had been accused of trying to get the capital city to New York City. People even accused him of paying off soldiers to march and point guns at the heads of the founding fathers. And he wrote this long letter to James Madison saying, now you were with me. You know I didn't do this. You know that I'm not behind this whole thing for New York City. So, the Congress moved around Trenton, Annapolis, Princeton, New Jersey. They shared beds. They were jeered at. There was no money. There was basically not a unified country. The Europeans were kind of writing letters to each other and saying, this won't last very long. We don't think this is going anywhere. So after about a year and a half, at around Christmas, 1784, John Jay had returned from signing the Treaty of Paris and being minister to Spain. They had offered him the job of Secretary of State. And why this is interesting is because he's the one guy who said, no, I just want to live at home quietly with my wife. I've done enough traveling. I'm turning you down. And he rode his horse to Trenton, New Jersey, where the Congress was sitting, and it was maybe a day or so before Christmas, and most of them had left. Very few people were still there. And he said, I might consider taking the job if you move to New York City. I've turned you down, but I really want to stay in my house with my wife and my kids. And so he said, so if you move to New York City, I'll take the job. So the 3 or 4 who were still there said, oh, sure. Okay, let's go to New York City. And then, of course, the Virginians started panicking because they knew that if you got to New York City and there were, gambling casinos and really fun places to go, amusement parks that were being built and, horse racing and theater and fun, the Virginians said, nobody's going to leave New York. This is really going to be a problem. And for 5 years, it was a wonderful place to be. Even as I said, Abigail Adams, who complained about everything not being up to her standards, said, I don't want to leave New York. Nothing will be like Broadway. And, that is about the only person I know, John Jay, who ran away from an appointment.
We've touched upon heirs. You mentioned, father-son relationships, and Washington had no sons, no daughters. He had, though, a lot of children. He raised his, siblings' children, Martha's children, Martha's grandchildren. And when I say raised, I mean actively. He was writing letters to his, step grandson in college, dressing him down for losing too many umbrellas. So Hamilton and Washington, because then Hamilton doesn't have a father figure. they bond in this way. And then of course, Schuyler is actually his father-in-law. What is that like?
Well, I'm going to backtrack for 1 second. George Washington even sued the estate of Martha's late husband to make sure that Jackie, his stepson, and Martha actually not only got the proper accounting monies owed them, but he had them measure their land to make sure that other people were not infringing or getting 1 foot extra. And in fact, he found out that Martha's, her late husband's father had taken a little bit extra land from the estate than the appraisers, the surveyors, had measured off. So Washington went to court and said, you're not getting this land. I don't care if it's 6 inches. It belongs to my wife and it belongs to my stepson. So it was always, about land. So then Alexander Hamilton, of course, as you rightly said, looked to George Washington as a father figure. And he married Betsy Schuyler. And of course, Philip Schuyler becomes his, father. Well, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington had a falling out during the Revolutionary War because Hamilton wanted to go to battle. And George Washington, it was a wrenching problem. He did not want Hamilton to die. He had seen too many young men die around him. And it was a selfish move. Of course, also Hamilton was brilliant and helped him in ways that nobody else could. But it was a selfish decision. He did not want Hamilton to go to battle. So Alexander Hamilton was really angry because he wanted to be a hero and a swashbuckling, figure. And he wrote to Philip Schuyler and he said, I'm sick of him. I'm really sick of this George Washington. He's not letting me do what I want to do. And Schuyler said, settle down, just settle down. This will pass. Don't create a kerfuffle with him. Just leave it for a while. Maybe if you ask again nicely, he'll let you do it. And at some point, that is exactly what happened. And I wondered also if this was going to impact the relationship between Schuyler and Washington. And it never did. They both knew what was going on and they didn't really dwell on it. They didn't really even discuss it because I think both men were older and they knew that Hamilton was kind of, a tempestuous young guy. And, he'd get over it and maybe ask nicely again. And that's what happened.
We've talked a little bit about this and we're getting towards it, but Washington, was broke all the time, despite Martha had money and he managed it for her quite a lot. And he, he got a substantial amount, but he had to make sure that the heirs were being taken care of and everything was well managed. But at the time of his death, we see he has all this land.
Mm-hmm.
He could have sold it and had absolutely no financial difficulty. And not only that, he could have done what the Marquis de Lafayette was trying to get him to do for decades, which is emancipate 123 people.
Right.
Because you can't just, say, have a good life. You have to sort of pay a fee. And then if they're older or have been, hurt in your service, then you have to provide a pension. But he always sort of said he couldn't do that. Why? And then the question I was often asked on my book tour was, why didn't he just sell the land? And so I'm going to put that to you because I think you'll have a better answer.
Well, I don't know if I have a better answer, but I have one answer, which is he was president of the Potomac River Canal Company and its largest shareholder. And that is why our capital was moved to a swamp. He maintained this position at the same time he was president of the United States. And of course, today that would cause a big problem, a conflict of interest. The emoluments clause would be thrown at him and all of this stuff. In those days, they were still finding their way as Americans, because you have to realize too that in Europe, let's say you owned waterside land, you could collect tolls, you could collect duties. You basically, it was all privatized. So there wasn't this, government would control the infrastructure thing. He owned a lot of waterside land. He kept hoping they would connect the Potomac River with the Ohio River. And he thought that Martha and his children and, his grandchildren, would be left very, very rich at some point. and a shareholder and largest shareholder and president of the Potomac Canal Company, he really believed in this whole project. So he undertook the design of Washington, D.C., which of course was not at all where the Residence Act said it was supposed to be, but he placed it there because the Great Falls was there. What was the Great Falls? The Great Falls was the biggest obstacle to clearing the Potomac River. It was the most expensive part. And the engineers just threw their hands up. And it was costing so much money, the Potomac Canal Company was basically going bankrupt. So Washington thought, well, first of all, Alexandria was going to be the nation's capital, the capital of this new empire, because he had surveyed it and nurtured it. That was his hometown. So the Great Falls is now around where Georgetown is in Washington, D.C. And he thought, okay, if we put the federal government right there, the federal government, of course, has to clear it, has to pay to make this navigable, because that's where the center of all the government is going to be. It didn't happen, but that was his hope.
Can you talk a little bit more about his hopes? I mean, he dies, a few years after leaving office, but he had plans for Washington. He had plans for the capital city. What was he going to do there?
Well, he had plans for the capital city. He also had plans for his land out west. Today we, know it as West Virginia. In those days, it was just Virginia. He was designing cities back in the 1760s. He was, figuring out, as we know of something like a Levittown, building houses and creating industry and trying to create an entire self-sufficient city. And that's what he was trying to do with Washington, D.C., to create this monument to the new empire. And he wanted it to be as important as ancient Greece, ancient Rome, hence what we call the federal style buildings. They emulate the classical structures that we know.
The first thing he did when he got a little money was order busts of all the great generals.
That's exactly right.
Such a funny move. There is a lot of resistance when you enter early American studies and you say something is not as it seems, or I'm approaching it in a radically different way. There is such a strong proclivity to celebrate, and the slightest criticisms are taken as attacks. And so I'm wondering, has there been resistance to this? Have you had a fun time, debating this with other historians?
With your friends, the Thymen, actually,
yeah.
Personally, yes, and I don't care. Because I really want readers to read this and figure out, oh, wow, this is the real story. So all this stuff on Wikipedia has to be revised. And you can't keep teaching, stuff that Thomas Jefferson made up and take it as fact. It did not happen in the room.
I know. I was just thinking that people prefer it, though, and he'll have to write another song. Maybe you can get him to do it.
Maybe it did not happen in the room.
Now that there are so many errors in the musical, you might as well just go with it. You've done interviews, you've done events, it's been out for a month. People tend to ask the same questions. What?
No, actually.
No, you don't think
so? No, they ask very different questions.
Well, I find they're the same. Well, that's exciting. And I was going to ask you, is there something that you really want to talk about that no one has asked you about?
That's the best question I've gotten. That's the most different question. No, people just come up and ask questions that interest them after either reading the book, or if I make a comment about how so many of these issues are with us today, like infrastructure. I wrote an article for the Washington Post about how in the Constitution, our federal government is not authorized to spend money on infrastructure. So how did this happen? Well, basically, it does boil down to the New York-Virginia rivalry, because the Erie Canal was built and James Monroe said, we have to figure out a way to make this Potomac Canal Company work so we can have the same advantage. Well, they called it the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And he got the federal government to pay for it under the auspices of defense and interstate commerce. And the Constitution does authorize the federal government to pay for that. So issues today, Washington statehood. The founding fathers did not want Washington to be under the jurisdiction of a state. They wanted it to be its own independent federal district just because of what happened on that day, the Mutiny Day, when the governor of a state would not come to their rescue. And we had a January 6th style invasion in June of 1783. So January 6th was not the first time that our seat of government was invaded by angry citizens. There are so many issues today that I can point back to that are in this book, and why the founding fathers made decisions they did, and why we have to protect their vision. I think, and the Constitution. This is very important to me. I think the Constitution is an amazing document.
Absolutely. I want to open this up to the audience as well, so you can start, putting your questions in the chat. During your research, because you did it before the pandemic,
That's right.
what was that like? What was your process? There's Founders Online, of course, which anyone at home can access. It's the greatest gift the National Archives have given us. At home, you can log on and you can read not only the letters of the founders, but they're annotated, they're hyperlinks, the citations are there. It's all the founders, the men, and Abigail Adams, because she spills the tea. But what was the rest of it like?
Well, Rotunda is also wonderful at UVA. The annotation and the cross references are brilliant. And then, of course, trips upstate New York and into the New York City archives. The Maclay diaries. Have you read Senator Maclay's diaries? I urge people to read those. Boy, does he tell the truth. He doesn't water down anything. He really is. Those are great fun, the diaries to read. Walking around downtown Manhattan gives you a great sense of history. I made a point of eating at Fraunces Tavern and walking around Trinity Church. And it really gives you a sense of how great this city is. And I really wondered, why on earth would anybody want to leave? Then the interesting thing to me also is once our founding fathers and mothers created a duopoly, other countries who wrote constitutions based on ours also created a duopolies. But this notion of our shining city on a hill, separate from, corruption and all that, the real story isn't that at all. It was that George Washington had 100,000 acres on the Potomac, and he, twisted arms to get his way. And that was both the funding bill and the removal of the capital from New York. I've
tried to think of new reasons, some way to understand the whitewashing of history, because it, again, is just the complexity makes it really interesting. And one of the paltry answers I've come up with is that we are a young country, and other countries, you see the British are always dragging each other. The crown is quite embarrassing for them, but they talk about this freely. Is it because we're still forming our national identity that we can't sort of handle what you are saying, which is that, profit and patriotism, they go together. They always have.
Yes, both of the men, Schuyler and Washington, Hamilton too, of course, and Robert Morris, a whole bunch of them saw that if you create something wonderful that your neighbor will use and benefit from, and you make money doing that, it's a very patriotic thing, because many people can benefit from this. So they did not see that as incompatible. And that's, of course, part of the whole 18th century, Scottish Enlightenment capitalism kind of thing. They were products of that.
Well, this is an interesting question. I do think it ties back to this idea of, everything ties back to the money. But Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton appeared to live a long life, a healthy life. She lived till 97. And so David would like to know if that kind of longevity was, unusual. Is there an explanation for it that's specific to Hamilton and Schuyler?
I mean, what can you say? Genetics? I don't know.
I mean, I think that, she obviously had a difficult life at times, but but there was a level it never dipped below.
Right. Very true.
Um,
Actually, there's a kind of funny story if you want to hear this. When the Jays came back from Paris, when they were living in Paris, Sally Jay, who was a first cousin of Betsy Schuyler and the other ones, people mistook her for Marie Antoinette. And of course, I'm always interested in Marie Antoinette because of my other book and family and that kind of thing. And one time she entered, this performance and people just stood up and applauded. So she came back to New York with all the latest Paris fashions and hairdos, and she was sort of the fashionable ringleader. She convinced Betsy Schuyler to get this massively uncharacteristic hairdo and have a portrait painted. And that's around New York City, and you can see it. So there's Betsy Schuyler, who's this kind of very pretty but simple, American girl with her hair in this giant upsweep and the portrait. And it was Sally Jay saying, oh no, we all have to look, glamorous like that. And the same with Kitty Dewar. They all had their portraits painted, trying to look like Marie Antoinette because Sally Jay talked them into it. I think that would have been lots of fun being in that group. They were women who were very well educated. They were very well read. Our educational statistics of people who were literate was higher than in Great Britain. The women were very well read, and they were forward thinking too. They created charitable organizations. They built hospitals. They were, the beginning of the abolitionist movement there in New York. So I think they would have been a very interesting group to be around.
I would have liked to have been around them. I would not have liked to have been around Jefferson's granddaughters because they were very mean when they went to balls. And their letters home are great, but they're pretty brutal. They did experiment with all of these things that are sort of recognizable. At one point, they get gold put on their teeth, shaved down, and they put gold on it.
That's pretty horrible, isn't it?
How did Washington manage the emoluments cause? And in the Constitution, was it ever an issue with early presidents?
As I said before, they were finding their way. So, for example, there were no term limits on the presidency. And if he wanted, he could have stayed president till the day he died. And the conversations about do we call the president Your Majesty? Is this going to be an inherited kind of thing? I mean, yes, there were electoral votes and things like that, but they were finding their way. So I don't think people wanted to challenge him very much. When New York City was evacuated by the Congress, people were very unhappy, and they did criticize him in the press. They had nasty cartoons and things like that, but nobody criticized him as far as let's impeach him.
Yeah, Washington, of course, had no heirs, so that was comforting to people. And he had given up power, so it was okay if everything wasn't worked out. He literally, he annotated the Constitution, president. But he, yeah, I mean, I'm going to move on because there are a lot of good questions here, and I don't want to interject too much. S. Frank has more of a statement, actually, as a comment, not a question. Washington obviously copied the British canal system, and he gives examples of that. Prior to the railroad system, Britain started developing canals, first with Bridgewater in 1761, highly profitable, and then a golden age of canals occurred in Britain between the 1770s and the 1830s, during which, the majority of the network was built. So he obviously, of course,
Philip Schuyler went to see the Bridgewater Canal, and when we needed that kind of apparatus during the Revolutionary War, he built one, as I said, upstate New York. And of course, a lot of Americans were interested in canal systems, and they went to see it, and they toured it. Franklin, Carroll, people, and George Washington stayed with the Schuylers, and he traveled around the rivers also, and he knew that this was serious competition for Virginia.
There was a question earlier about primary source research, and so we've talked a little bit about that. And again, there's Founders online. You could, Google it in another tab. I remember hearing something about the Mount Vernon Compact. Did it have an impact?
The Mount Vernon Compact, he actually excluded James Madison on purpose. And that was a situation where that was the beginning of interstate cooperation. And George Washington was in Annapolis, Maryland, working on this canal cooperation because of the charters, the land charters from Great Britain. Maryland actually owned the Potomac River. So you could own land on the Virginia side, and you wouldn't reap any reward. So what you had to do is get the cooperation from Maryland. So he practically killed himself, and he wrote James Madison, it's Christmas Eve, I'm exhausted, I've been doing this for days, but he wouldn't give up. So he had people come to Mount Vernon, he wined and dined them, and he left James Madison out of it. And he went ahead and, worked on this to make sure that the Virginia and Maryland, both sides of the water, would profit from a canal system. And he lent his name to it and became president.
How has NYC benefited from no longer being the capital of the nation? Also, is DC a plan specifically for government functions?
It's funny, they call the Beltway, was sort of the highway around DC. I call the Beltway the Washington, DC, New York City Beltway, because as we all know, and this is quite cynical, politics goes nowhere without money. So, and Wall Street goes nowhere without politics. So I see this Beltway as including both places.
This is another, this one asks you for a comment in response to a comment. I thought Robert Morris and William Maclay were angling for Pennsylvania to be the seat of the federal government. It's true. And Morris was confident they would land it. But part of why it didn't land in Pennsylvania was that Morris and Maclay weren't working together. What do you have to say to that?
Once that mutiny happened, there are mountains of letters of people writing to the governor of Pennsylvania, to Robert Morris, to other leaders like Benjamin Rush, and they said, we are not going back to Pennsylvania, period. We didn't appreciate having guns held to our heads. We don't want to go back. Also, the Southerners, especially the South Carolinians, did not want to be around the Quakers. They found them sober. They did not want their slaves freed, in the middle of the night, and they felt threatened by that. They were not going back to Philadelphia on a permanent basis. Even though George Washington tried to make deals behind and saying, we'll have the capital on the Pennsylvania border. We can do that, so you guys can profit from, river travel and canal systems and things like that. But nobody had intention of going back to Philadelphia. They just wanted to use their votes.
Yes.
Politicking.
I'd like to know why Miss Nagel believes that the dinner that led to the Compromise of 1790 is a myth, which you've talked about a fair amount.
Yes, and nobody wrote a week after that or a month after that, what a great dinner we had and we solved everybody's problems, and isn't Thomas Jefferson great? Nobody even wrote letters home to family, like Hamilton and Schuyler were together all the time and writing letters. Even, people wrote each other letters around the corner. They would dispatch a letter to a neighbor down the street. And nobody said, wow, isn't this great? We've all settled everything. The fight went on. The fight did not end that night. It went on for weeks. And actually the funding bill, the details of the funding bill went on for a couple of years.
Yes, I mean, it's
that's what amazes me, by the way, about how anybody could have believed that, well, we had a dinner party and everything was wonderful. And the next morning, every problem was solved.
But the point you make is true, because when you are digging into these letters, it's not one letter describing an event.
Right.
It's 5 letters to 5 different people,
right,
more or less the same, sometimes a different detail, sometimes a different angle. It's always really interesting to compare, but that's how you learn. And when that's how you learn about events, and if there isn't any mention of an event.
Well, and of course, Maclay in his diaries over and over again, I know that Washington's behind this stuff. He's such a politician, and he's behind all these deals that are happening in the back room. And that's where it happened, in the room. It happened at Washington's house that spring. That's where it happened. And as a matter of fact, James Madison was his front man, because Madison had disappointed him for a while. When George Washington was sick, he got the Alexander Hamilton's funding bill to be rejected. And of course, Washington wanted the funding bill. So after Washington got better, James Madison was quite contrite and came back to Washington, crawling back and said, I'll do whatever you ask me to do. And he said, okay, well, get this guy and this guy and this guy. Let's tell them that we're going to move the capital to their districts if they vote for funding. And Madison said, I am the opposition leader. I cannot vote for funding. So he said, okay, so make sure you get one more guy in Virginia, not you, who will vote for the funding bill. And Madison never did vote for the funding bill.
I think that's another thing that always comes through in good books about the founding era, and particularly about these gentlemen. They were always fighting. And Washington died, he wasn't on speaking terms with Madison and Jefferson. This is a very good question. It's sort of a fun one. Which one would you like to have to dinner?
Oh, Alexander Hamilton.
Why?
Well, he was brilliant. So, I mean, don't you love a brilliant mind? What an interesting dinner conversation that would be. He and Madison actually worked so well together, because if you think about a partnership, one is extemporaneously brilliant, Hamilton. The other is the most prepared and best researched person in the room. So they were a wonderful combination. And of course, that's sort of emblematic of our country, because they were both sort of opposing sides. Of course, they wrote the Federalists together, but one becomes a leader of the states' rights, or later the one party, and the other is the consummate Federalist. And yet together, they really were a marvelous pair.
How would you sort of, so let's say you couldn't pick, if it wasn't Hamilton and you had to sit down with Washington, what would you want to talk to him about?
I would want to know everything he was growing, butchering, milling, distilling on
He
his
would love
property.
to tell you about it.
I would have loved that. I would have taken notes and thought, okay, I'm going to buy shares of stock in that company, or I'm going to do that with the animals I've got, or maybe I'll invest in one of those little houses in the dream town he's building out in West Virginia. I would have wanted to know him as an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. And that was how you found out all the information from him, because he was so tight-lipped, and that's the way you would get him. That's very smart. That's the way you would get him to tell you things. Whereas with Alexander Hamilton, it would just be like so much.
You could just sit back and let him talk.
Yes, he was very good at digging his own holes. I want to talk about the physical relationship that one has with research, and when you're doing it. I have not written a group biography, or, I focus on, one person, and I feel sort of strange when I leave their home. Like, I'm so used to Mount Vernon that, I gave a talk over the summer at Morris Jamel. I've been to the Schuyler mansion. It feels different. I almost feel like I'm a guest in a way that I don't at Mount Vernon. How does it feel to navigate all these different properties and these different spaces in the nation?
There's a wonderful story. If you visit the Schuyler mansion, you've seen Philip Schuyler's bedroom. And there's a wonderful story. The British general had been marching through Saratoga and lost, of course, the Battle of Saratoga. And actually, it was Philip Schuyler who designed the strategy and then was replaced. And so he then took this British general into his house, gave him his own bedroom. So you can see the master bedroom, and that is where the enemy slept. The enemy, of course, the British general, wrote home and said, I've never met a more Christian man, a more gracious man. And this is what you read over and over again about Philip Schuyler. So I walked around this house, and especially was really drawn to this master bedroom, thinking the enemy slept here. And then the next night, he and his wife slept there.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of interactions with people in these situations is always fascinating to me. I wouldn't want to really have dinner with any of them. I would just want to be present in the room.
Well, Mrs. Schuyler was a character too. She came from one of those grand families. And when the British Army was marching down, they were trying to, of course, get food. She said, burn our fields, burn all of them.
Washington said that in retrospect about Mount Vernon, but I'm not convinced he actually would have felt that way at the time.
I agree.
What do you think about, after you're done writing a book, there are things that occur to you or things that are lingering that you just sit with for a long time. What is still there for you? What do you still find yourself thinking about?
I think you cannot spend a few years with somebody without really, really liking them. And I found that with every character I've ever written about, they're close to your heart, or you wouldn't spend all that time with them. I so admire the three major characters of this book, all three of them for different reasons. But I do see Washington and Schuyler as such similar men, and I understand their friendship, And I think it's kind of sweet to think of Alexander Hamilton as the surrogate son and son-in-law of these two very grand men. And he's got the greatest mind, and he is looked at as, a younger, the next generation. And I just find that so interesting.
That's absolutely true. One can be accurate about the primary sources, which sometimes does not put these men in the best light. And particularly
you made a really good point too. If you read one letter, you say, oh, that's interesting. But if you read 5 different letters of people corresponding back and forth about the same thing, you get 5 different opinions, and you have to sort through, well, he says the party started at midnight. He says the party started at 10 and they were smoking cigarettes outside for 2 hours, or that kind of thing. So it's really, really fun to go from somebody like Maclay to somebody like Jefferson. And John Quincy Adams years later said, Thomas Jefferson just makes up a lot of stories. So
it's true. By the end, they were pretty direct. And it's true, one can be critical of these men and still really admire many things. I think about Washington as a parent. He was a really good parent. Mm-hmm. He was a good husband, except when he went on tour a lot. Martha didn't like that. What connection at all do the descendants of these families, to the degree that they're still around, have with these properties, with this story?
Well, of course, on the Hudson River, things have been sold off, but the old town names remain. And I was actually someplace where a descendant of John Jay came up to me and said, I can't wait to read your book. So I was very excited. That's kind of fun, being in New York and having descendants of some of the families. I know a Livingston and other people, and they come up and say, I can't wait to read what you've written about my ancestor. And I like that, because I think they trust me. They know that I write the truth. I wrote a book on Lady Elgin, and that was very controversial. And I got phone calls from the heads of the Greek government, the heads of the British government saying, now you've done it. And, I just looked into what really happened behind the removal of the Parthenon marbles, the Elgin marbles. And I just look and dig for the truth. And sometimes it's not what you want to hear.
What do you think that you will write next? Because it's interesting to see all the books together. And I want to actually, that goes to I'll go back. I'll ask you that question next. How you've written about so many things that I'm interested in, Josephine, all of these things. How do you go, though, from those topics to early America? People do really, I said before, people do struggle with the 18th century when they've worked you've been in this century, but this is a different story.
It is and it's not. Even though, we didn't have the internet, they were so connected in so many ways. The British, the French, the Americans, the trading and politics and the wars, they were so connected that it is and it isn't. There were the same players on an international stage on a macro level. And I find that really fascinating. I like the idea of looking at macro and then looking at issues behind the macro level, the tiny issues, the micro issues. So, we've got Louis XVI lending money to the Americans, and I've got Louis XVI decapitated in another book. We've got, the the British players going off to the Middle East, Nelson and Napoleon, and we've got Napoleon selling later the Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson because he's thrown his hands up because of the revolution in Haiti. He just says, I'm not dealing with the new world, you know. They really are interconnected. And I just love immersing myself in that world at the, you know, the time of it.
And it is really fun to see different perspectives and just to see them from different circumstances. So what is next?
I've got a couple of ideas, and I have to think them through, and of course, you know, do all that research. So for right now, I'm, you know, concentrating on this book, and I hope lots of people read it because I love the story. I love the men in the story and the women. The women who ran New York City in the 1780s were just so dynamic, you know, and I would have loved to have been a friend of all of theirs. We had the first hedge fund guy who was married to one of the first cousins. His name was Dewar, D-U-E-R. He ended up in jail, but he was the first hedge fund guy in the 1780s.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Well, thank you so much, Susan.
You are so welcome. It was such fun talking with you.
It was so much fun, and it was you really do bounce around from all these things, and you make these connections that are unique. And I encourage everyone to pick up the book. It's excellent. And it also makes you sort of reconsider a lot of the other books that you've read around this topic. And so it's always really nice when books are in conversation with each other. Thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you. I think have a good night.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Congratulations, Susan.
Thank
Hope everyone
you.
goes out and buys the book, and thank you, Alexis, for the great questions tonight. We hope to have you back again sometime. Everyone that was watching tonight, if you missed some of the event, the recording will be on the Graduate Center website soon, but you can always email the Gotham Center at Gotham Center. Well, look us up on the website at gothamcenter.org. Enjoy the rest of your night, and thank you so much. Congratulations again, Susan.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Good night, everyone.